Welcome to all of you from the region representation of the Hessen here in Brussels concerning artificial intelligence, the technology of the future. And no, this is not a deep fake. You will have experience with that in recent times. My name is Hendrik Kafsack, correspondent for Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung in Brussels. I'm really here. You can believe it. You don't have to believe it. And afterwards, I'm going to discuss with Mr. Stengg from the cabinet Vestager to know how artificial intelligence should be regulated. Before we get started, I'll give the floor back to Wiesbaden digitally for a welcome address by Mrs. Puttrich, Minister for Federal and European Affairs of the State of Hessen. Dear Mr. Stengg, Mr. Kafsack, ladies and gentlemen, so AlphaZero is the name of the software that almost 3 years made quite a fuss on a worldwide basis. In just 4 hours, it managed, by autonomous learning, to become unbeatable in the game of chess. Much better than all humans and machines beforehand. Whereas it had been taught only the ground rules of chess. Even the present world champion Magnus Carlsen indicated that in his tactical choices he was quite inspired by AlphaZero. This is just one example among so many others, leading to the insight that there's a revolutionary potential based in artificial intelligence. And so quite rightly, the Commission has seen the need for action and announced and proposed an approach, a European approach, how to treat artificial intelligence. And that's our discussion topic today. I deliver a warm welcome to our live stream, and I'm happy that so many of you have been able to follow my cabinet colleague's invitation, Professor Dr. Kristina Sinemus. So artificial intelligence is part of the critical technologies, as they are called, meaning that they have potential opportunities and risks that are difficult to calculate. That's the best description of artificial intelligence. On the one side, you have breathtaking opportunities. The applications for artificial intelligence seem unlimited. Early detection of illnesses, autonomous driving of cars, more efficient traffic management, deliver recruitment tests, biometrical identification of persons, and the optimal moment to be chosen for the maintenance of industrial installations. A lot of the future applications are not even to be foreseen today. But on the other side, we have the dangers linked to AI. On the one hand, the opportunities, then the risks, interconnected and generating ethical and more questions as well. Who will be liable when there's an accident caused by an autonomous driven car? Who's protecting us against mass surveillance or discrimination due to badly taught algorithms? This is questions for all of us. Artificial intelligence is marking our daily lives already without a clear framework for action. The danger is that fundamental rights and European values might be threatened. This is the time to direct this discussion, and these disruptive technologies have to be oriented in the right way. The Commission, with its white paper on artificial intelligence, has delivered a broad catalogue for action in this area. The biggest part by far of software in the area is produced in China and the US. Europe has to reinforce and interconnect the technology and the knowledge, and the innovation has to be improved and reinforced. And it's quite important as well to have a matter of trust here. The societal acceptance will be broad enough if ethical standards are being fulfilled here. The new European legal framework for AI is really important here. We do need this also in a global context. Artificial intelligence has a lot of potential for each and everyone amongst us. society and industry and economy. And a broad societal debate has to take place concerning the role of AI in the legal framework. This is really important. And that's exactly what we want to prepare and contribute to with our discussion today. I'm looking forward to an exciting debate, and I'm really happy that you're with us. So this makes me think that for me, a digital artificial intelligence is still necessary to be beaten in the game of chess. Not really, but that's another matter. Before delivering the main part of our program, our discussion, I'd like to give the floor now to Professor Dr. Kristina Sinemus, Minister for Digital Strategy and Development of the State of Hessen, second impulse contribution, and then we get into the discussion. So, thank you very much, dear Mr. Stengg. We hadn't seen you on screen. Dear Mr. Kafsack, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really happy to be with you today in this future technology podium discussion about artificial intelligence and deliver a contribution from the Hessen point of view and also from our point of view as Minister for Digital Strategy and Development. In the statement of the white paper of the Commission, I'd like to quote a sentence. Artificial intelligence should be at the service of people and be a positive force for society. We can all agree with this statement from the Commission's white paper on AI, and this is really part for our action as well, digital policy being the title here. It's only when we're sure that AI and other technologies are really serving human interest, then we will have an opportunity to take up the advantages and minimize potential threats and dangers linked to its application. That's easier said than done, because can we really trust technology which inner logic is kind of a black box from the developer's point of view? AI will mean mathematical algorithms are being applied and connected to data with a higher level of quality. They will improve the final result as well. Who will guarantee that fundamental rights will be preserved in the digital space? Well, in Hessen, we are quite leading AI location in Europe, and there's a really matter of importance for us. And our innovative and vibrant AI ecosystem for the future will be further developed. We have a large number of Hessian startups and companies that are developing or applying AI-based solutions. A lot of SMEs here, and robot technology is being applied here as well. Another application area is self-running wheelchair developed with AI at the Technical University of Darmstadt, leading here as well. But the AI ecosystem is prepared for the future in Hessen as well. We have the Center for Responsible Digitalization, research center taking care of applications as well. And secondly, we have also an all-encompassing initiative. The Hessen AI has been founded here as well. So we have research and application-oriented activities, and we have the Council for Digital Ethics as well in Hessen to have a quite clear-cut view on human impacts linked to this. Different theses have been published in this context end of February, and we'd like to deliver this as a contribution to today's discussion. Thesis number one is we need a European legal framework that clearly regulates AI without overshooting the mark. The dynamism of the AI development threatens to reduce or threaten the digital sovereignty of people, and that's the reason why we need a EU-wide regulation determining and regulating, but not over-regulating this area without hindering further developments. And the trust of the population in AI has to be reinforced, and such a framework is to be seen in the context of the regulations of the Digital Service Act, which has been launched by the Commission already, but has to be seen also in the context of the white paper. Thesis number 2, we need more market diversity in the area of artificial intelligence. Despite its huge potential, Europe is quite lagging behind in the area of KI development and distribution, quite far behind the US and China. This has to change. Local companies have to be supported in order to be placed as competitors in the long run and create more market diversity. It's our SMEs in the area, but also what I mentioned initially, the AI ecosystem of startups that has to be further developed. And that's why we want to take care of this here in Hessen, but also on a federal level. I'm quite certain that also on a European level, with European hubs, there will be an AI interface in order to have possibilities in the future to have the population and the companies as well in a position where we can choose amongst different competitors. Yes. Thesis number 3, we need more knowledge about artificial intelligence. It's only when I'm really aware of what's going on I can evaluate. AI applications are quite complex in general. I talked about mathematical algorithms linked to data that are presented in order to optimize them. And even for experts, it's sometimes difficult to see when I'm talking about a strong or a weak AI, what kind of criteria can we help to evaluate this. Nevertheless, I'm convinced that all citizens of all age categories should be taken along this path, allowing each and everyone to have at least a certain minimum knowledge about AI. They have it already, or we can help them to have it. This will support the trust in this new technology, but also give the possibility to have well-funded decisions being taken, be in citizen really knowledgeable about this area in order to distinguish between the things I want and those I don't want. And then the 4th thesis, we need more interdisciplinary AI research. Only in a contextual research activity will I be able to have applications seen in the context from the point of view of the economy, industry, and society, and determine a framework where AI will not be over-regulated, but still open to new possibilities, because artificial intelligence is generating a lot of highly ethical questions. What am I allowed to do and what should not be done? What's value-based in a correct orientation, or where do we have to put certain limits? These questions have to be asked and answered, not at the end of a product development, but already in an integrative approach within the process for the initial decisions. And that's why they have to be integrated in the product development phase already. This is necessary in order to make sure that right from the start, in an integrative approach and in a sectional approach, we have AI development with trust in the society. Interdisciplinary research is necessary for that. Ethical questions being taken into account right from the start in a broad societal dialogue for the development of applications, because at the end of the day, AI should also be in the service of the population, leading me to my initial quote of the white paper of the Commission. Artificial intelligence should be at the service of people and be a positive force for society. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Sinemus, for this introductory impulse statement. And now we'll see Werner Stengg on the screen as well. He will appear on the screen, and he is from the cabinet of Vice President Vestager, responsible for this area. And to make it easy for me, I could say the DSA minister from Brussels being involved in this area before the Commission for years and years. We will not say how long this has been. From a certain age onwards, like in my case, you don't say things like that anymore. But doesn't mean that it's just on the side as a core responsibility. No, it's a main area for all in order to talk about all these topics and facets of AI. Last week, the was the proposal, so it's quite new. Discussions will get started in the European Parliament among the member states, certainly within Germany as well, to see what's good and not so good about this new proposal. And that's what we want to talk about. I'd like to mention one thing additionally. As usual, you can ask questions. Please do not hesitate per mail or per telephone, as you prefer. You see both now on the screen. So get started writing or calling. We have almost half an hour for the discussion as such, and that's why I'd like to get started with discussion right now. Connected to a point that Mrs. Sinemus just mentioned. It is a reality that we are lagging behind AI-wise investments, patent registrations as compared to other continents or countries. As I said, well, the Chinese and Americans are doing this, and the EU is regulating for what? So, Werner, that's your moment to defend your proposal. Thank you very much for the introductory words, for the initial statements from both ministers. I'm quite in agreement with big parts of their contributions. It's about the location Europe to start with, for the development and usage of artificial intelligence for the well-being of our societies. Lots of applications here, and there's a legal framework as well. If you have a look at Brussels, you're always tempted to talk about bills and laws. So we are quite good at regulating, or at least better in regulating than at doing. But the Commission has indicated quite early on that both aspects are important from our point of view. We want a digital transformation supported, reinforced in Europe as a digital location has to be supported. All our proposals are going in that sense, all investments as well. You tend to forget about that. Legal framework is supposed to accompany this. I will not reduce its importance. It is important, actually, but primarily the trust should be given and delivered in this technology. If this is not given, all these investments will be of no use, and there will be hesitancy to use this technology. But it's a matter of trust, and it's a matter of legal certainty as well. We've talked to a lot of companies recently. They want a legal framework because from the entrepreneurial point of view, there's major questions. What is allowed? What will not be allowed? If I'm supposed to invest in development of technologies or use them as well, well, I want to be sure that 6 months later, 1 year later, no one will come around and say, this is not ethical, this is not allowed, so take that back. And thirdly, it has to be done on a European level, because what our companies really need in order to move closer to China and the US is a functioning internal market. 450 million people. We have a very strong industrial base here, which is a positive aspect for Europe. We have been lagging behind in the last phase of digitization, the major platforms turning themselves to consumers. We lost the game, we can say that. But now it's a completely different world here. It's the industrial world, the world of data, and there's a lot of strong points in Europe. So at the end of the day, important point to crystallize this is the internal market regulation, the same rules everywhere, to make sure that this market potential can be brought up, which is not the case until now. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Commissioner Breton at the press conference said Europe is now the place to develop and use AI, because we're the first continent having a clear-cut legal framework to do so. If you talk to companies, this legal certainty is the most important part of all. If this is the case for 27 member states, the whole internal market, then we can say, okay, we know what's being allowed here and what's not, so let's do this. And this supposing that this will certainly be the case, because this is just the initial step of the legal process, not the end of it, to be quite precise. But to get back to this a little bit more, Mr. Breton and Mrs. Vestager, your boss, do they believe that companies might say that we would prefer to do this in Europe because we have a legal framework which we have not otherwise or elsewhere in the world? Well, I cannot tell you what Mr. Breton is really thinking. No, what's your point of view? Your view. Well, let's start with the European companies, okay? When you're acting and developing activities in Europe, this major internal market, as we wish for it to come, will be your main advantage. And we have to wait for that, you're right. But a lot of American companies have a major footprint in Europe. It's not that they do their stuff in the US and we do our stuff here. This is completely connected and linked. So it's going to be a huge playground for all of us, and you have a huge level of certainty to play there. So a lot of people talk about the Brussels effect going even beyond, with linked to the hope that the rules that you have in Europe can be exported and that the whole world will orient itself. Is this really playing along here for you? Well, that sounds a little bit imperialistic. It's not the main objective of these rules that the rest of the world have to take over. No, the main objective is that our 450 million citizens in Europe are not supposed to put to risks connected to these technologies. This is the first aspect of regulation. And secondly, we're creating a legal framework allowing our companies to grow and thrive. If additionally it leads to a situation where others take this up because it's really intelligent as a ruling, and they don't have anything else. So in this order of objectives, this would be highly favorable side effect, if you like. So let's go back to 3-4 steps, back to Brussels, back to the Commission, back to the proposal. And those people who are maybe not really wondering about what's going on with this proposal is pretty new, and to take them along. What exactly is your approach? Certain applications are to be prohibited, which for ethical reasons are really difficult to be implemented, or others will be put to certain surveillance activities linked to the risks. Please describe what the basic idea would be here. Well, the decisional factor here is the risk, a very good short version, if you like. We are not regulating the technology as such. So artificial intelligence is it good, bad, mean, or easy application? No, it's the areas where this technology can or will be applied, and that we don't want. There can be ethical reasons for that, moral reasons, but it's not about the ethical aspects only. It's simply enough to talk about the enforcement of existing law. We have a fundamental right not to be discriminated based on our origin, our agenda. We have protection of the private area, other fundamental rights, but it is sometimes difficult to enforce these rights because we have the black box effect, yeah? It's not so much about having so many new values or ethical ground elements to be created. No, we want just to make sure that existing fundamental rights can be enforced. This is one thing. What are high-risk application areas that might threaten this? And secondly, next to these fundamental rights, we have product security. One of the other speakers said that when we have an autonomously driven car taking up new data, adapting its behavior all the time, and something happens, this has to be taken into account in the legislation. So fundamental rights to be protected on one hand, and product certainty on the other hand. And then next step is the identification. What is high risk here? And we have an annex to our regulation indicating products that are right now already not being brought to the market because they could be a fundamental threat for health aspects. For instance, if there's an AI component involved here, it has to be studied as well. For the other things, the criteria are such that my life is influenced possibly in a way, taking away opportunities from me, and I have no possibility to correct this. And this is the case for me, but many other people as well. And one example here would be recruitment activities for a company. You want to use a technology in order to be not obliged to read hundreds of CVs, but the determining factors for me being in the first choice or being allowed a credit or whether public institutions are taking up and that I'm being discriminated because the data are linked to me are not good enough.
Just to make this more concrete, there is a differentiation between illegal applications and high-risk applications. So what kind of examples could you give for that in a certain framework? What influences our lives? Can I get a job? Do I not get it? Asylum is a very important aspect that is mentioned in this context, but what concretely should be forbidden from your point of view? Well, I'll have to start with the pyramid, because that's the best way to graphically represent our proposal. If you look at a pyramid, at the top there's very little room, and there are 3 or 4 application cases at the very top that we do not want to see in Europe. An example for this could be if the technology manipulates children in order to push them towards acts that would endanger the child. Imagine a doll with AI that teaches the child and suggests to the child that it should leave the house and cross the road. That kind of manipulation we do not want. Another thing that is forbidden is social scoring. We do not want to have a social scoring model as it exists in China, where many aspects of everyday life are just tracked, and the AI will decide. So if someone has done this thing or that thing, they will no longer be supported in certain ways. So data that can be collated, can be assembled, and can be used against me. That's something we don't want. And another example is long-range biometric surveillance. Mass surveillance is something that's being discussed a lot in the media. What are we doing with facial recognition? And there are many, many application cases, many ways to apply things that are absolutely not a problem at all. If I use my face to unlock my phone, that doesn't violate my basic rights. If I have biometric data on my ID in order to cross the border, that's not mass surveillance. But if the police here in Brussels in the city centre was always running a program on the video cameras to check if any of the people that are currently moving through the city centre could be on a list, that would be a step too far. That is uncontrolled mass surveillance. That's what we do not want in Europe. If we look at influencing and manipulation children to their disadvantage, that's already becoming a little bit unclear, because that is what all of the social media are doing all the time, because they're manipulating, be it adults or children, influencing people to do things that are to their advantage, maybe to the disadvantage of the consumers. Isn't it this already the point where it becomes very difficult to apply this in practice? You're right, this is a difficult topic. We're talking about manipulation beyond influencing. So this is not talking about buying a candy bar that is unhealthy. Well, if that was a problem, we would have to ban all advertisement, because advertisements are manipulating us into buying things. So that we don't want to go that far. So the text has to be very clear to see where manipulation happens, where we are being pushed towards actions that we wouldn't have taken otherwise, and that are massively disadvantages for me. Not just like eating too much sugar because I'm buying a candy bar due to an advertisement, but really dangerous health risks. Let's go back to the image of the pyramid. So you could have different levels on this. Why did you decide to only take the very top level? This is what we do not want, social scoring. This is high risk, this is forbidden, this is high risk, and the third level, all of that is all right. I think there is like a low risk where there is some obligation of transparency, where you have, for example, you have to be transparent and say you're not talking to a real person, which, for example, will not always be obvious, but there is no other differentiation. There's only those few levels. Don't you think more levels, a more granular distinction would have been better, especially if you look at the obligations this will bring for companies? But that's exactly the point. The more granular you are, the more levels you have on that pyramid, the more complicated your legal framework will end up being. We wanted to be very clear on problematic applications of AI, have clear rules for those, which of course doesn't mean that the rest of the pyramid is not completely unproblematic. There are other aspects that can be problematic, but don't have to be. If you have a control in, for example, in a factory where you just have quality control, this doesn't endanger workers' rights. But there are other aspects that are much more dangerous. There are applications that are not high risk, but there are mechanisms such like contracts, for example, that you have to push through. But nothing is happening in a legal vacuum. It's not the case that it falls under this AI regulation, or you can do whatever you want. There are other parts of a legal framework, a right to private life, a right to privacy. This is really about the enforcement of the law. This is not a legal vacuum, even if it doesn't fall under AI regulations. You're talking about the economic sector, you're talking, and it has been mentioned last week when this proposal was set up, that machines in general could be seen as high risk, and that would kill anything that could happen in innovation, in machine construction, machine development. Has this just been misunderstood? Or is this indeed maybe too much higher level of caution? Well, I haven't heard that reaction, and I wouldn't have understood that reaction either, because if you look at engineering, at the machines that come out of this, they are not concerned by the fundamental law aspects of any of this. This is about products that are already covered due to product safety legislation. For example, medical instruments, toys, other machines all have certain norms and standards that have always been part of our laws that have to be respected. The standardization serves a purpose. This purpose is being fulfilled by the standards. You have to fulfill certain requirements to be acceptable on the European market for European customers, and these standards have been developed in cooperation with the industry to see what kind of possibilities there are to comply with these standards. And that is how it works. That is how it will work in the future through standardization. There's just additional requirements for a product. So if you add AI, there's additional requirements, so you have to make sure that the data that you used for this AI are correct. You have to be transparent about how it works. You have to make sure that it is reliable. You have to see where you can have a human in the loop in order to correct any mistakes or errors. But how this is used for certain types of products is something that will be part of standardization. In general, not every type of machine has the same risks. For some products it will be a safety question. For others, now let's go back to the idea of a toy. It could be a completely different question that would have to be solved. The doll will not hurt me, but it could suggest me to jump out the window. So that's a completely different aspect, and this will be adapted case by case, but this will not be part of this regulation. We cannot fix everything in this regulation. No, this regulation is set up to be flexible and to be adaptable in such a way that it makes sense. Yeah, but on the other hand, standardization is not something that can be done in 2 weeks. It will take time. And it will also take more time to get the certainty you wanted to create with this regulation. This will be further down the line, and which means, of course, that the legal framework is not as clear as intended. Maybe I don't agree with that, because otherwise everything that we've been doing for product safety, product security, for years would be put to the question, because this is how we've been working. It is traditional product regulation. And if you write into that, you have to use this manufacturing process, you have to use this technology, then you cannot use new technologies to achieve the same goals in a better way the next day. So this flexibility is necessary to be technology neutral. And the same applies for AI. So we cannot just fix how AI has to be used and checked for the next 10 years. That would be absolutely unrelated to reality. And we are, as you've mentioned, at the beginning of negotiations. But until we get to results, of course, it will take time. And we have to build capacity in Europe, in the standardization institutions, as well as in the member states that have to do market surveillance and have to verify and control all of this. So this, you cannot take any shortcuts. It will take time. So what you mean is it'll take 2 or 3 years until we have a very clear framework. That's part of the nature of the things. This is it's a negotiation. You've mentioned it, which of course always takes time. This is going to be thoroughly checked and discussed. And such a proposal will probably take 18 months of negotiation, and then, of course, the industry will need some time to adapt to such a proposal. But that doesn't mean that in the meantime you can do whatever you want. We're setting something up that has been created in the last few years. It may not just be legislation or regulation yet, but high-level experts in the EU and the OECD have coordinated, and the companies themselves have assembled some company-wide standards, and they're not just twiddling their thumbs and waiting for 3 years or just doing whatever they want, and then we will become completely ethical in 3 years. That's not how things work. Everybody is paying close attention to what's happening in AI. So I think we will see a lot of voluntary adaptation, of anticipation of what will happen in the future on that level in order to be able to invest. Now, for special requirements for high-risk applications, you've mentioned that data should be neutral. So, for example, to avoid that everything will go to white men because they just don't take, for example, because there are just more advantages on certain levels for the company. Let's not go into that too much. But and of course, I'm simplifying this very brutally, but I can remember that there were discussions with CEOs of Google and similar companies that this doesn't really work. Mr. Sinemus has mentioned the black box, but tech CEO said this would be too complicated in any way. And if you look at the definition of an AI for humans, it would be crumpled clothes is what makes a person a person. That's how the AI defines a human being. And that clearly shows how difficult it is, how an AI learns, what it has learned, what basis it used to reach what conclusions. So how should this work in practice, to put it into a nutshell? So a human in the loop means there is a loop. There are certain moments when you're using AI where you can have a human in the loop. And this, of course, will be very different from application to application, which is why, once again, in this regulation, we just describe a principle that you have to adapt to different cases. So there is no one-size-fits-all solution. Human in the loop doesn't mean like 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It can mean very different things. It means that when this technology is being developed, you have a human element in development. You have a human element in application. If someone buys an AI and uses it, for example, in order to recruit people, to find the right person for the job, then you would have to have a person in the loop somewhere that participates in the decision. They don't have to understand how the black box system works, but just that they can recognize mistakes, recognize errors, and fix them. And you can also have a human at the very end of the loop, that there just is a possibility to submit a complaint and to have this checked. For example, they didn't grant me a credit. And I think I should have. I think this has happened without a human in the loop. Can this please be verified? That's a way to do this, because it has to be possible to anticipate how this works, what kind of data goes in there, how reliable is the output of the system, that you really can just dive into it and check and find where it went wrong. Human in the loop means a lot of different things. But it doesn't mean that you have to understand everything that the AI has thought, if I may use the word for this person. No. Let's take another example. A doctor uses AI to diagnose cancer. We all know that the software is a lot more reliable than what you can do with an X-ray image to identify what type of cancer, in what phase, what stage you are. It would be just much faster than the doctor, but it's not the machine that decides what kind of treatment you get. because it'll always be a doctor with its own knowledge, expertise, and responsibility will look at the output of the software. He knows how reliable it is, what kind of error margin there is, but the decision will always remain with the doctor. Let's get to the questions, because we're trying to move through all of this very quickly, but we will not be able to talk about everything because it's a very complicated topic. Simon Kessel, Association of Communal Companies in Brussels, and he would like to know the obligation of documentation and others for producers of AI. How does that impact costs? And wouldn't that, and then we get back to Ms. Sinemus and startups, if this doesn't set up additional obstacles for the development of their own AI for SMEs, and if this is not an obstacle that they can't overcome on that level. Now, if we're talking about high-risk application, we're talking about high risk, which is why this is a very short list, which is why we have concentrated on this measure being proportional. But there are areas we do not want to tolerate, do not want to accept in Europe. And we can't say, this is too expensive, so we'll just allow it anyway. You cannot have it both ways. We have to try to limit this list to make it very short and simple. But you shouldn't underestimate the internal market you get from this. But if you invest in a problematic technology, you will have to take certain measures to mitigate that risk. You're not in direct competition with China or the US, because if they wanted to sell their software on the European market, they would have to follow the same rules. So that's also very important for the area of application, geographically speaking. There's a lot of talk about sandboxing and what kind of experiment can be done, how this would be organized. But this is not linked to this, is it? It's somewhat linked to this, because this is supposed to be mostly accessible for SMEs. So if you're an innovative startup, small or medium-sized enterprise, and you have an idea to develop an AI, and you think that you will end up in that scope, or you know that you will be a high-risk application, you can go into that sandbox and you can work on this together with authorities on how you have to set it up in order to avoid having problems down the line. This is specifically meant for SMEs, so you're not leaving startups and developers alone with these challenges. You're taking them by the hand in order to help them. Yes, indeed. Peter Herle from Berlin has mentioned that, of course, it's unclear what the applications of AI will be in the future, that it's still very much unclear. And that there's a certain level of uncertainty about the areas of application, which leads into the core question: what is the list of high-risk application? Is it closed, or can it be adapted, updated? That's a very good question. And this is part of the flexibility we're trying to have and reach here, standardization as a flexible element of product safety. As we've mentioned, now the list itself, of course, has to stay current. What's currently in it is up to our current level of knowledge, where we know that there have been or are applications that are problematic. All of those are on the list. And the list is, logistically speaking, an annex. It's not part of the regulation itself. It's an annex, and the regulation itself has the possibility to update that annex if there are new applications. But there are very clear criteria for this, so we cannot just arbitrarily add things, add use cases after 2, 3, 4, 5 years. No, there are very strict criteria. There's a catalog of criteria that you have to fulfill in order to get there, so it will not take, but we won't have to take years to completely recreate this legal act. And Stefan Kran from DGB-BVV asks, in the regulation, AI impact on the workplace is only addressed very briefly. Aren't there any European rules? Wouldn't we need European rules about the rights of unions and works councils, especially as far as workers' rights protection are concerned? Well, I get back to my statement that this is not a regulation of the technology of AI in itself, and that we cannot put all of this into technology regulation. This should be a legal act for the this is a legal act for the internal market that makes sure that only products can be brought to the internal market that fulfill the minimum standard requirements. So this is about product safety and the internal market. We've mentioned hiring and firing, but that does, of course, not answer the social changes that will follow this technology. But for that, we need social policy. We need a different framework. We need other aspects. So there should be there's other parts of legislation that would apply to this. Sorry. As much as our time is limited, there's one more topic I wanted to mention, that is facial recognition. That's a highly emotional subdivision of this topic. You say facial recognition is forbidden, is only allowed in highly exceptional circumstances, and people who criticize this legal act say that it is in practice allowed and only limited in certain cases. Why didn't you not just ban it on a general level? Because that way it would be very clear. Yes, it would be very clear, but it would not be adapted to reality. We are building on the status quo. People always tend to pretend that this is all completely new, but if you look into the data protection regulation, general data protection regulation, it already states that facial recognition is basically banned and can only be allowed in very specific situations. And that the same is true of the law enforcement directive, that is directly targeting law enforcement authorities. In both cases, there is the default position that we do not want this unless. And we have attacked again on the topic of unless. So mass surveillance is banned, is forbidden, and the exceptions are so strongly limited that we would need this to protect our society or population. For example, if a child has been kidnapped or if there is a terrorist attack at the airport in Zaventem and is running away, is trying to escape, and then if a judge allows it, police can for a limited time, limited locally and in time, to use facial recognition to find that terrorist. That's very far away from uncontrolled permanent mass surveillance. But we didn't want to ban these use cases. So people who criticize this approach are a little bit too radical, maybe. I say this reluctantly because it's difficult to find the right words in this, but they would rather not be under surveillance at all. People who criticize this are not wrong. No one is too fundamentalist in this debate. It's a very important debate, and we have to decide, what do we want? What kind of technology do we allow in our society? And there's always a trade-off happening. So either we say privacy is the most important, no matter what happens, and there can be no exceptions. That's one approach. And there are others who say, but what do we do in fighting crime? Because criminals will also use AI to their advantage, and they endanger all of our lives and all of our safety with that. And where do you draw the line? This is a continuum. And that's a very individual evaluation. And it's also the evaluation of the legislator here. We say we are very far along the side towards privacy, where we want to protect the right to not be under surveillance. But there have to be some possibilities. And if politicians decide we want to move a little along that line, well, they can do it, but it has to be a democratic decision. And anything that is connected to humans, there are people who really don't want to see that in AI. That's a very radical approach to this. Have you ever thought about an approach like that? If you look into the annex about the high-risk application, this is particularly about law enforcement and police work with AI. Especially in asylum and migration, there is a very long list of applications that are considered high-risk applications. Even though we take the needs of law enforcement seriously, we also take citizens' concerns about this very seriously. and those who are outside of law enforcement, these are all about people in some way. For example, do you get a place at a university, or do you get refused because an AI said the applicant is not good enough? No, this is a high-risk application, so you have to have a human in the loop. Even if he doesn't understand the black box of the eye, or rather cannot understand the black box of that eye. Thank you very much, Mr. Stengg. We have been able to at least shed a little light on the black box of EU legislation, or rather the proposal for a legislation here. And I'm very grateful that I don't have to sum this up, then that I can just pass the floor to Wiesbaden again and can leave this to Mr. Sinemus. And I would like to ask one more question. Can Hessen accept this proposal? And what does it mean for you? Thank you very much. I'll try to be very brief because we will have a meeting and I already should be there. But as far as AI concerned and the future of AI concerned, all of these topics are very important to us. And I just want to say that this approach of this regulation is a very good approach, where we only have a small area of the pyramid where we say we do not want this at all, and everything else is more about a framework and about transparency, because we do not know yet what AI will bring us in the future, what will happen in the future. But what we do need is legal certainty in order to be able to plan accordingly for our SMEs, for Hessen, for Germany as a whole, for Europe as a whole, in order to plan for the future, to do proper investments. And I'm looking forward to discussing this more with you in the future, because with legal certainty we can enable product safety, and this on the basis of fundamental rights. And I think all of those are great statements, and we want to actively participate with our colleagues in Brussels. And I would be very happy if we can talk about this again with you or with others, where we could have a Brussels roundtable about AI made in Hessen, made in Europe. So that is directly addressed to you, Mr. Stengg, of course. Well, thank you very much. I should draw your attention to the fact that on the 10th of May, we will continue here at 12:30 already. This is about digital finance with Mr. Vermeling. And I would like to thank you all for watching and listening. I hope you could digest all this information during your lunch break. Take a cup of coffee, relax for a few minutes. The topic will stay with us certainly in the future. Thank you very much for your attention.